Hello and welcome to this AMBA and BGA webinar on Future of Graduate Master's Education in association with the Graduate Management Admission Council. I'm Natalia Mańkowska, Commercial Liaison and Relations Manager, and I'm looking forward to an hour of really interesting insight. Shortly, I will hand over to our speaker, Nalisha Patel, the Regional Director Europe for GMAC, to start the conversation. Before I do, some housekeeping. We want the session to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just add them to the question box for Nalisha to answer live at the end. If you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in post-events comms and on the AMBA and BGA websites within a week. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Nalisha.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I'm just going to ensure that everything's up on the appropriate screen. A very warm welcome to you all. It's always a pleasure to connect with the great network of business education and professionals from across the sector. My name, and thank you for the warm introduction, my name is Nalisha, as Natalia said. I'm the Regional Director for GMAC Europe, and thank you for joining to discuss the future of graduate management education, but it's grounded in a report that we released this summer called The Future of Graduate Management Education from the perspective of the top European deans. Now, of course, it's got this Europe focus in, that's also the kind of region that I cover. However, what you'll see throughout this is most of this is very applicable to the wider sector, and obviously we work in a very international environment in this sector anyway, so just to kind of give you a bit of a setup there and a little bit of background kind of just on myself. I have spent the last 15 years in graduate management education. I have been at GMAC for just over a year, running the team here that supports the business schools to be able to attract and recruit talent from across the world and to support the candidates in their journey to business school. So that's kind of the remit that we have over here. And I previously I previously spent 10 years at London Business School. I worked in various roles there, the most recent one running the degree programme portfolio. So I feel as though I have kind of quite a broad view across the sector, which I know is often very helpful in these kind of conversations and also these kind of projects. So I really hope that you find this afternoon informative. And of course, you know, this is a webinar, it's a smaller group. Please do contribute if you've got any questions or if you kind of have any thoughts along the way. If I spot them in the chat, I'll try to pick them out. I know Natalia will be collating them anyway, and we can have more of a discussion towards the end. But I guess just to kick off with some context around the organisation and also the report itself. You know, as a global connector, I guess, the GMAC of GMAC is continually invested in advancing the sector and to serve the needs of a relevant and inclusive student body across the world. And so, you know, the rationale behind this report, which is really something new for us. You know, I think many people will be familiar with our regular cycle of reports, and then obviously we do specials as well, but they're very focused on a lot of our data, because we collect, we are privy to, we are partners with a number of organizations, which mean we create this whole host of incredible research that we push out into the sector. And this piece is actually slightly different. You know, it's more of a thought and opinion piece coming from you know, some real change makers in the industry. And reason being, I guess, is you know, it's not really a new phenomenon. You know, we're always talking about, okay, what next in any sector, right? What's next? What does the future hold? How are things evolving? But I think particularly around our sector, it's not a new phenomenon that the relevance of going to business school or doing graduate management education is questioned, or is at least the value is questioned and the ROI. But in today's kind of context and world, I think the legitimacy of that is under even more contention. Questions are constantly being asked about whether business schools are, you know, as these staunch academic institutions are able to react and adapt in the way of the changing world and the pace of the changing world. Disruption, as we know, is very rife in the education industry. I mean, disruption is kind of the norm now, right? So when you think about, let's put in the context of kind of constantly evolving and advancing technology, evolving learner expectations, fluctuating program demands, and then kind of all different types and varieties of market entrants. And then when you couple that with the kind of recent global challenges, there's a real sense of poignancy that this is a time for rethinking and reimagining what GME is or at least should be. So it's within that context that GMAC has sought to pause and reflect on what the future holds. And you'll see here the selection of people we interviewed in this report are 20 of the top European business school deans, you know, people who are kind of thought leaders in the GME industry, and we wanted to gather their insights onto the future. And before I get to that, I do want to ask just a couple of questions just to help me frame my conversation and to make sure that it's as valuable for people as possible. But firstly, if I could kind of ask you, you know, what do you think are the key challenges and opportunities that are facing our sector? And I'll give about 30 seconds for people to kind of input any thoughts that they have. And you'll note here, I think it's a single sort of choice question, but you may feel that all of them are relevant. You may feel like others are relevant. If it's others, pop them in the chat. And for the poll, please just do, you know, submit the one that is most poignant to you right now. Okay, so quite a balanced spread here. Interesting. Okay, I'm just going to make a quick note of that so that I can hone in on that as I discuss. The next question I have is just again another framing of the conversation for me, and that's what is your area? What's your area of focus in terms of work-wise? Are you admissions professional, marketing, etc.? That again helps me in context. Obviously, these are quite static, but the ones that's most closely aligned to you is best. Okay. Okay, so programs focused. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, so let me kind of get to it. And this is, so first of all, we just wanted to give you, there is a detailed methodology in the report. I'll give you access to the report afterwards, etc. But just wanted to kind of start off with just an overview as to where these insights have come from. And you'll see some really kind of interesting names across here, spread across the region. We tried to get a very balanced spread across lots of different institutions that are kind of doing interesting things in the sector, that are kind of have spread of portfolios and students that are coming from all over the world. And what I want to do is, I'll come back to that in a second, but I will use the time to, it's going to be tricky, but I'm going to condense what is actually a 45-page report, which actually is a further condensation of over, I think, almost 1,500 minutes of video recordings from the interviews that we conducted with these deans around these topics. And I could talk all day. Luckily, you don't have to listen to me all day. However, I want to kind of pull out the themes and quotes as well that I think are really poignant in this report. And interestingly, again, this is why I find kind of your areas of focus and what's most poignant to you at the moment so interesting is, so these are the 5 themes that came out from this report. So from the many interviews that we did, it became very clear very quickly, actually, after not that many interviews, that there was a real alignment of considerations of themes. Now that said, there was definitely differing opinions and different takes on these different on these themes, and that's kind of the interesting lens that I want to kind of run you through as we go through our discussion points. So I'll kick off with the technology and digitalization, and this is kind of, it was a very obvious one. I mean, it would be pretty crazy if this wasn't something that people were addressing in that kind of future of GME piece. And it's been obviously a topic of discussion in higher ed for such a long time. Obviously, it was given a huge kick in 2020 when we went online. And initially, the views of some of the deans are that, and even themselves, you know, they've been quite honest that online programs were sometimes frowned upon and seen as perhaps of lesser value compared to fully present programs. Francisco from Imperial remembers that, and I'm going to quote him. And again, with the quotes, I have got the quotes in front of me, so I'll pull out a little bit. However, I'm not going to get the exact terminologies and the specifics right, but I want to give you the sense. But Francisco from Imperial remembers that 3.5 years ago, before the pandemic, you know, having to defend his online MBA against a couple of deans that were defending very strongly the notion that the on-campus MBA was the real thing and the online was something that is not quite the same. And so, you know, business schools have dabbled in adoption in technology, I think, in their teaching, and yet progress and process has often been previously quite slow. And that sentiment was echoed throughout the conversations, but the key point coming out now of that kind of forced online movement is that we have to think about the utilization of technology, and that warrants a completely new think about kind of content and ways of delivering that content. And a rehaul of that curriculum could also, you know, really mean a changing quite rapidly in the way that business schools think about teaching. And I think we've already seen huge amounts of examples of that. I've seen some absolutely wonderful examples of creative use of technology in delivering kind of pedagogy and learning experiences across the classroom. I think Johan from Holt made an excellent point around teaching excellence might once again trump research excellence as a foundation for good business education in schools, which I thought was quite a controversial but interesting opinion point. He went on to explain that the pressure on faculty is to not just go from their office to teach and then return for more research, but to develop a whole set of new skills to capture an audience and to teach knowledge, as well as skills, and doing so in hybrid formats. That's quite a differing setup. And Wendy from Edinburgh describes how you actually have to go and sit down and you design differently from the start, and you make materials more accessible, you break it up, you have different media in order to produce content from online. So again, some of this, it feels almost like some of these narratives feel quite second nature to us, but it's all culminating in this rethink of, okay, well, you know, rethinking this means rethinking of this, which means a rethinking of this, right? So these are all kind of gradual thought points. And I think that, you know, this interesting next bullet point was a really key one, which is that technology, a number of comments around technology not really being seen as a differentiator anymore. It's still a cause for, that was still a kind of disputed point. I think some people agreed more than others, but fundamentally this was quite an interesting point, because of course opening access to education for many more learners across the world who typically may not have had access or couldn't have come because of proximity or whatever the circumstances, now have this access. However, that wide reach could also lead to a very different business landscape. So I think that those two elements coming together was a really interesting a really interesting notion across these interviews. And Johan, again from Holt, mentioned how he could see, which is a really nice quote, a bifurcation in the competitive strategy, so that a few niche players offer high cost, high value face-to-face education, while a whole range of other players offer low cost online education. So he's thinking more about, you know, you'll have much clearer segmentation in the market, which again, as I said, that's, you know, these are the two ways of looking at the same coin, right? So interesting point. I think, you know, the optimal learning formats to use going forward, you know, as I've mentioned, they evoked quite strong opinions, often conflicting, as I've just kind of outlined one of them. But one aspect resonated throughout, and that's that a combination of the formats should be used, and it should be used differently by different business schools to find their own balance. So Joseph from ESADE put it quite aptly, and he said that every school and every program would need to find its sweet spot in terms of what that balance would look like in terms of online, hybrid, in person. And I thought that was quite an interesting a way to put it. But yeah, back to that kind of earlier point, is that, you know, many people just stated that clear divide, or that bucketing, or that black and whiteness between online and on campus would disappear, and that things would just grey between these, and actually more prominent would be, okay, well, what is it that the student wants, and what do they want to get out of it, and how does this, you know, what can we do in the program in between to make it the best for that. Others were adamant that the on-campus experience would remain most important. We try really hard not to kind of, one of the points was actually that at INSEAD, there was a point that we try, I'm just going to read the quote, we try really hard not to just be there to dispense extra knowledge or to build toolkits, but to help inspire people to different perspectives on themselves and the world. And one of the ways in which we achieve this is through the experiential learning that takes place, not just on your own, but in an intimate setting with the talented individuals that are very different from you. And there's something about this, the way the minds collide and connect and interact with each other, that is difficult to replicate online. And I thought that was a really beautifully articulated statement, and again kind of highlights that the differing views around this use of technology. Another point is kind of, for me, which was not really discussed, is how the business schools are kind of set up in terms of their technology and digitalization, because there was very much a focus just on delivery here. You know, there wasn't much around, okay, well, this is possibly going to need an entire digital transformation for themselves. You know, many schools and many organizations, and I'm sure everyone kind of has examples of this, have, you know, we've had to adapt But what does that mean now? What does that mean, those quick fixes, those adaptations? If we're rethinking things, what does that mean for us? And what does that mean for us to, as a sector? What if these business schools are looking more closely about utilizing what's most appropriate for their pedagogy? How do we take a step back and ensure that those systems are set up to do that? The other thing I was really kind of fascinated to note, instead of actually being in the conversations, it's something that was quite absent from these interviews, was that there was very limited references made to things like AI and blockchain and virtual reality. The concept of the metaverse wasn't, I think it was mentioned once, and that was focused very much on the option of it being on as a learning platform. I think that, that this will be a really key thing for us to, as a sector, consider, not just as content or a learning platform, but also the unintended consequences of some of these evolutions. Specifically, if we think about kind of data ethics, data use, consent. But yeah, I wanted to kind of flag here that I found it interesting that they weren't a key feature in any of these conversations. And perhaps, that's something that is either assumed or it's kind of more focused in and around curriculum considerations, but I wanted to kind of highlight it as something that didn't come up. The next topic, and again, I do note that this is something that for this group was lesser on your priority list or your kind of ordering list. However, it was a really key part of the conversation with the dean. So I will cover it from kind of their perspective and think about how that relates to a kind of more program delivery or program design element. And I think this comes from a place of, business schools are seen to be the breeding ground for future leaders, and they have a responsibility, let's say, to teach more than just the bottom line, to enable their students to navigate that complex intersectionality with business, environment, social, corporate governance factors. And I think that there is a realization from my conversations with these deans that if we have no society, we have no business, and thus no business education. And Marion from Blurry elaborated quite nicely on this one, which says, I always say we cannot have a flourishing economy without a flourishing society. The question of what business contributes to society is being asked more strongly and more frequently, and business schools need to be there to help answer that question, as well as bring it into our classrooms. So again, once we get to the discussion, I'll be really keen to kind of hear your thoughts on some of those points in terms of bringing these into the classroom and how you do that effectively. But I think there was a couple of other quotes I want to highlight, or at least kind of surmise on it, and that is, that there is now a sufficiently wide group of stakeholders, including business schools and companies, that are taking sustainability seriously. There was it felt as though, or in the conversations, again, I'm paraphrasing, there was a rhetoric around climate change and sustainability more broadly 5 to 10 years ago. But there is now much more growing concern about being a socially responsible school, and how that sense of urgency has accelerated in the last few years, and moving away from that being a rhetoric to a more tangible strategic priority. I think that, on one hand, people had considered that, this was a separate topic in the same way that perhaps technology had been seen previously. But we know now that it has to be embedded in the same way. It's not something that can have just, a one course on and then that's done. And I guess just to point out here, I just want to, under this category, I've included quite a lot of things. So I've included things like social impact, ESG, CSR, sustainability, because people have described them in different ways, but just to kind of condense it for the purpose of the presentation. And I think just moving on to the kind of next point along, which is around the stakeholder demand. When you look at what learners are looking for, and what particularly, and I'll come on to the the trend around younger learners in a moment. But when you look at the data in terms of what perspective people are expecting from their business education, this features heavily. And so that is something that's, it's becoming the baseline. It's not becoming, something new. It's not becoming exciting, something different in the curriculum. This is kind of something that's being very much expected as a standard. And I'll just finish that point on, because Anthony from UCD had a great point on this, or a great quote on this, which was, he further notices how incoming students are much more concerned about environmental issues, long-term sustainability. It's becoming a very important theme, and they're pushing us educators to deal with the issues of sustainable societal good throughout our programme portfolio and in terms of their own school strategy as well. So I think this is a really key point, is that, as business schools start to embed more of this content, are they also looking at how they are operating as a business as well? That's a really key point, I think. And on the diversity and inclusion piece, I want to give a very fair representation of what was and what wasn't discussed in this report. There was a lot of discussion around specific underrepresented groups, such as women. But I think what was a little bit missing was the inclusion piece. So Antonella from Bocconi Grad School, she'd made a good point, which was we have to maintain a strong focus on inclusion to ensure all motivated students have the opportunity to join programs. And I very much agree with that sentiment, which is why I wanted to highlight it, because I was surprised at how, given my work with many business schools, I was surprised at how few comments there were around kind of how we promote inclusive environments, as opposed to kind of focusing on some of the measures of that, if we call them measures. But I think we wanted to kind of highlight that point. And I guess, some of this, what I've been talking about, in terms of themes, it very much directly flows into the content, so the content of our program. So that's kind of the next thing, the next theme that I wanted to talk a little bit on, and just forgive me one moment. The first point that was kind of discussed quite a lot was this concept of coming out of the silos, and I've got to say that was music to my ears, because my many years working in programs, that was one of the biggest points for me, in terms of ensuring that we started to we got our students to think in a integrated way, because it's not, sadly, that someone's going to be doing strategy on one day and finance on one day, and thinking about the digital on another day. No, because you have to think about these things collectively and see how they link together in order to make a business decision. Maro from Cambridge was talking about we're going through a major transformation to do with demographics, geopolitics, and we're seeing a changing in guard in terms of global leadership as well. We also have this kind of panoply of social and political problems in the world. And so there are many, many things going on, so many moving parts, that there are so many transformations going on all at once. And again, that really highlights that need for interdisciplinary learning and thinking. And I think that approach will mean that students can link the fundamentals of business with the rest of the world to be able to tackle those big challenges that they're going to be faced with. There is a great quote from Eloic from HEC, and he was talking about how students need to talk in different languages. So 20 years ago, you had to speak English and maybe 1-2 other languages. It was kind of seen as an incredibly great skill, but now you also need to be able to speak Python. Do you speak nanotechnology? Do you speak AI? Do you speak climate? Do you know what the measurements are behind those? And do you know what they actually kind of fundamentally represent, and what the ripple effects are on your business decisions? And so I thought that was a really great point that he made around that that evolving intersectionality as well. And coming back to that earlier point about how we stay relevant as a sector when everything around us is moving so quickly. I really think that ability to, well, the expectations on business leaders right now are far reaching in terms of their complexity, and how do we set people up as a sector and as industry to get that moving. One final quote I will just kind of hone in on, and that's Lars from SSE. He said, business schools need to be a transformational journey that provides students with the knowledge and competence needed to navigate this uncertain, volatile world. And the way that you do that is introduce things like, for example, lots and lots of humanistic elements, exposing them to art, making them read fiction, exposing the students to serve us with an intellectual itching powder of different kinds, and not just studying the usual textbooks, he explains. And again, I thought that was a really fascinating quote, given, you know, the kind of staunch academic institutional history that we often see and experience, and kind of thinking about things in you know, broadening that mind of the learner, and the benefits that can have, being recognized by some of these deans, I thought was a really interesting development, and quite nice to see. You know, I think that, you know, it's you know, creativity can exist in lots of different ways, and I think if you're, you know, if you have learned how to be, or you can, or you have a space to be creative, that gives you the kind of capacity to do that in other places. Behavioral skills, again, something that, you know, the industry's been talking about for a really long time. There is a lot of great suppliers out there. There's a lot of great work that's happening in-house in business schools, and there's a lot of, obviously, research in the space too. But I noted that a lot of deans had said that they felt that they were still lacking in terms of helping people acquire those so-called people or social skills, things like emotional intelligence, teamwork, negotiation, people management. And Mauro from Cambridge had mentioned how alumni speak of never realizing how important leadership skills and teamwork skills would become later on in their careers. Essentially, this is telling me that we don't do a good job at conveying to them how important they are while we're there in business school. And I think that was echoed across a couple of the interviews. And I think so there needs to be almost like an extra boost in effort to incorporate these kind of these skills throughout the curriculum. And also not just having them in the curriculum, but persuading may be the wrong word, but how we kind of demonstrate the value to the students. That, you know I've had students in the past who have not really kind of just seen them as kind of, you know, described as soft classes, and, you know, you really have to kind of spend quite a lot of time in being able to you know, build that case of the relevance and how and when it impacts their careers, giving them practical experiences and opportunities to practice some of these things. Francois from LBS, and my previous business school, again makes a great point, which is, if you only wanted a toolkit, then you're wasting your time with us. You should only come to us if you're open and curious to different perspectives on yourself and the world. And I thought that was a really nice quote. But that does come with a challenge, and I know this. You know, I'm very, very hyper aware, but I am aware that, you know, teaching behavioral skills at scale at a reasonable cost is also a big challenge. You know, ideally, you probably want every single person to have a coach throughout their program, but realistically, that's absolutely not feasible from a cost perspective. So that there is, you know, while we know that possibly across the sector, and a lot of people I know, I talk to about it all the time, can see that this is really valuable, there are challenges to overcome this. And again, something for the sector to think about. Research, and that's kind of, again, this, you know, talking to deans, of course, this is a poignant thread, but, you know, thinking about how business schools can, there was a lot of comments on how content can be grounded in research with a deeper collaboration between companies and researchers. So we all, you know, I've seen great examples of that happening already, but how do we, you know, how do we as a sector, how do we help the sector bridge that gap between, or even, no, sorry, further kind of close that gap and further intertwine companies and research. I think a couple of the deans noted challenges here around kind of funding, and what are the funding structures around business schools in the future. How do you fund world-class academic research out of a commercial operation? That's an important consideration, of course. And then kind of, I'm just conscious of time, but you know, the point, and the next point I want to cover is internationalization. And again, lots of different views on this. There was fascinating perspectives on the kind of, particularly, let's think about one example, which is kind of the exchange programs, experiential study abroad trips, where, you know, these types of activities. You know, we've seen you see a huge benefit from these. You see great positive student feedback often, but then obviously if you balance that off about something else we've been talking about, such as kind of climate crisis, that kind of model does kind of come with considerations, right? You know, some deans see schools going back to kind of very right back to pre-pandemic, and I know kind of travel is much, I mean, it's still difficult, don't get me wrong. I've just had a couple of quite nightmare trips myself, but you know, some deans think that, you know, everything will go back to the amount of travel, the amount of business school based travel as before, and thinking about conferences, etc. You know, but some mention that they don't believe that might be the case at all. A couple of deans, two deans actually, in fact, started talking a little bit about what about imposing or thinking about imposing internal offsetting or if internal taxing on your travel. So again, causing people to think more closely about what they're doing in terms of their internationalization. And again, actually, this is kind of quite interestingly linked, because, you know, as this evolving landscape forces people to kind of rethink the content and research, and coming back to that last point, internationalization, presumably the structures that either govern, and obviously, you know, AMBA included, and let's call them assess and rank, etc., you know, will they evolve too? What is the push and pull there? Some people, again, not everyone agrees on which way that push and pull exists. I think there was a lot of discussion around rankings, around kind of, you know, where those weightings are given. And I think there's been much discussion around that for many years, and you know, I think it will continue on. But there was a lot of discussion around, okay, well, with this evolution, which one will be the driver there, and how do we better collaborate and move forward as a sector working together? And I think that's a really key point. The fourth point, the fourth theme was around learning journeys, and again, not something that we haven't talked about for a long time in the sector. Absolutely something that's been on the radar, particularly when you talk about things like lifelong learning. But again, I think that what became obvious is that no one's quite cracked it. No one knows exactly what that really looks like yet, and what that means. Because obviously there's huge operational considerations that come with this, financial, you know, planning that far into a future, you know, an infinity future is a difficult thing, right? So what does that, how do we shape that? How do we make that possible for people? And there were some great thoughts that came out of this, you know, from Johan at Hull. He mentioned something which I thought was fascinating. He was like, you know, will we become you know, co-curators, or are we going to evolve into, will there be your likes of a Spotify or a Netflix or you know, something like that hosting the content? Or and I thought that was just a really fascinating concepts that came out, and again, not yet to see major examples of this. I've seen some kind of interesting thoughts around this space, but it doesn't seem like anyone's kind of fully got really beneath the skin of this, because of course it comes with lots of operational consideration, not least the ones that I mentioned, but then also when you're thinking about faculty, IP, access, things like that. This isn't an easy topic, so it's not a surprise that this hasn't kind of got a resounding one answer yet. But I think that, you know, on this piece, it was kind of interesting to see that these journeys, these, you know, they were previously a bit more linear, right? It was much easier to plot out a student journey in terms of, okay, this is when someone might start to consider GME, this is how long it would take them to kind of enroll on a course, this is what happens throughout the program, and then as an alumni here might be some touch points. Whereas that's kind of got so many different kind of layers to it, as well as kind of it's got lots of dimensions to it. And so I think that there was an interesting thing to pick up on. And coming back to our earlier conversation around blurred lines, I think that is a concept that kind of threads throughout this. Is there's a lot of blurring of, you know, there was a lot kind of more boundaried or kind of segmented elements before in lots of what we do, and a lot of that is kind of merging together because people want more flexibility, personalization, things that are more relevant to them. So again, not completely surprising. I think this concept of changing learning patterns is interesting, and you know, whether, you know, people want to do, you know, shorter courses or study over a longer period of their life in order to achieve a qualification. You know, I think that it's not just about delivery anymore. There's going to be lots of different kind of changing connections between degree and non-degree activity, which I think is a really exciting kind of evolution. A lot of people mentioned this changing program demand, and what people, these two are kind of linked. So there's a changing kind of learner patterns, but there's also the leading to and also kind of feeding back into the learner. But you know, the shuffling program demand, I think it was recognized that there's a clear growth of the pre-experience programs, such as Masters in Management. Many comments around the demand for their pre-experience programs skyrocketing. And, you know, I think that's something that we've seen over the last kind of at least 5 years, if not longer. There is also this kind of concept of the, you know, of course our learner is, with the pre-experience, that the learner is younger, and so what they're looking for is different, and how they make decisions is different. And I think that's also been hugely important in terms of you know, our recruitment marketing professionals and how they think about how they reach their audience. So there's a lot packed into this kind of evolving landscape of needs. And yes, again, I mean, I'm conscious of time, but I have talked about the technological advances and what that kind of filters into. But what I wanted to mention here was really, you know, previously we were in a model where proximity to campus was the kind of a key part of decision making, and what happens when that geographical differentiation disappears. You know, it kind of forces people to define what really makes the school special, I guess, you know, what that means. Okay, I will race through my last slide, and that is kind of, I just wanted to, this one I thought was interesting because, you know, when discussing the future with these deans, even though there's so many kind of complexities and challenges and things to think about, the overwhelmingly, the tone was very positive in these conversations. It was very excited for the future. It was very focused around opportunities. And so I think that, you know, we're still a growth industry. The demand for managerial expertise has never been greater because we are going through these major transformations. And that was a quote from Franz from IESE. And management education is fundamentally built around this idea of continuous training. And so with that fact itself, the kind of that change itself will drive the need for education. And so again, coming back to this relevance point, is that all of these thread into us as an institution, as sectors. As a sector, we need to kind of demonstrate and be relevant. So it's both of those things. I think throughout the conversations, it was kind of evident that the changing landscape that we've kind of talked about, and the market calls for each of the individual institutions to be clear on what sets them apart by defining their purpose, their aim, their strategic priorities. And some of the deans felt like that wasn't always the case. You know, Francisco from Imperial said that if you go back 30, 40 years, that there wasn't as much of a strategy. Either you were present in the undergraduate or not. Either you wanted to have a really good MBA, and then you could leverage some executive education if you thought you had enough of a base to do that. Now you have a whole new universe: MBA, non-MBA, pre-experience, post, digital, on-campus, hybrid, exec ed, partnering, standalone, skills orientated. I thought it was great that he was kind of like listing them all out, and then again coming back to the blurred lines between all of them. Coming back to his quote, very few of them actually think hard about what it is they want to do, what type of education they actually want to give their students. And he stresses that going in and trying to find an identity is something that's going to be really important. And he doesn't at the moment think that there are any perfect answers at this time. So I thought that was a really kind of interesting insight. And I think it's quite accurate. It sums up kind of a lot of the discussion that we've had across the different themes around well, kind of in all of this, being really clear on a purpose and being able to communicate it, given those blurred lines and the intersectionality is crucial. I think also a key fundamental point that we've, as a sector, have been able to demonstrate that we are. But of course, as with everything, there is you know, a need to continue. But business schools need to be agile and open to change, but they also need, and then they're also teaching their students to do the same. So I think that's, again, coming back to that point of, you know, practicing what you preach, etc. You know, as we talked about in the sustainability piece, you know, there very much needs to come from the inside, and I think that was very clear. One final point, while I have the time, is that, you know, I think this is possibly something that all of us have faced, but it's that how to get that change to trickle down, and a lot of discussion here around having the right people and empowering right people, and the kind of very real challenge that people have faced with kind of the Great Resignation and people and changing of structures and staff. And I think that is something that we can work on as a sector. You know, that's something that we can support each other on in a cross industry way. But I think that is again something that came up quite boldly as a key thing on people's agenda, and getting the right people, both academic and professional staff, was key as a priority. So look, I appreciate I've gone a little over time, and I did mention that I was very prone to talking a bit too much on this topic. However, I want to, if you want to scan this takes you to the report immediately. Otherwise, it is available on the website. Anyway, you can type in Future of GME report and it will take you right there in Google. But I want to just to kind of conclude a little bit here, which is that on the report itself, you know, there was a huge overlap in the commentary, and I think that's the level of reassurance that the awareness of these common trends and things that we face are, even though our approach might be different, are shared, and therefore that's hopefully a way to tackle at a sector level and working together too. Again, the lack of comment around the kind of inclusion piece, and then the some of the technology pieces that I mentioned around kind of AI, metaverse, etc. For me, that does beg the question if enough forward planning and is happening for some of the evolving impact. But again, that just could be because those things are assumed and the topic of the conversation veered in another way. I just want to make that point. But look, to conclude, I really enjoyed working on this paper. It's something that was fascinating. I wish I could have crammed more into today's session, and wish we could have crammed more into the report itself. But we do hope that this paper and our ongoing research will serve as a key reference for you as GME industry professionals. The current times, they require rethinking probably all the time. It's almost like this constant rethink, but there is a kind of almost point in time that we're in that we can do as an industry that continues to be a key player in molding the leaders who impact the future of the business, future of society, ultimately the future of our planet. I work with a lot of great colleagues in the sector, and that really inspires me. And together with these insights that the thought leaders and change makers have featured in this report, I'm confident that we have some great people ready to do what it takes in the sector. So I'll leave you with that positive note, and I appreciate that there's been lots of discussion around lots of challenges, but I ultimately am very positive about the opportunities that lie ahead for us. Yes, sorry, I've left very short amount of time, but Natalia, did we have any questions in the chat?
Thank you, Nalisha. Yes, we've had a few questions come through. One of the questions was, what technology would you be investing in to future-proof your institution as a business school leader? Oh, great question. I don't think, for me, it would be a particular, it wouldn't be one technology. It would be ensuring that, that the technology structure for the organization, that I've got the right people in place to be able to, as we've evolved, not just in the last 5 years, but over the last kind of 10, 20 years, where we've been using kind of technology, you buy in certain things, you change certain things, you upgrade certain things, and so you have your landscape, or often landscape of a business, is so complex in terms of things that need to talk to each other in order to make things happen, right? And so for me, it's not about one technology solution to buy in. It's about being able to really think about that strategy so that you have technology that speaks to each other, because I think that is where you'll get the real benefit in terms of understanding, supporting, and delivering to that entire student journey. Thank you. Another question was, how can a business school create ways for students to naturally connect with using online platforms? Yes, this is I think that's a really, really, I think so many people have asked this question of me and of others, and I think it's been talked about in kind of so many forums. I don't think, again, I don't think it comes down to the technology itself. I think it has to come down to the forum in which it exists, and the way that it is embedded into other activity, and into other parts of, say, for example, the program. It's almost kind of, how do you, it's not like sneaking in vegetables into a child's dish, but almost kind of like, how do you make it feel like it's not a forced, use whoever had asked the question used quite nicely the word naturally, but the nature of an online meeting or an online activity is that it's a scheduled activity. So that natural element is very difficult to create. It has to be kind of embedded into other
activity, whether that is kind of there's an online activity to do, but during, but the setup of that, whether it be a group activity or delivery or a group piece of work, allows for times that kind of force natural conversation or natural activity. Those might be some of the ways that people consider it. But yeah, again, I haven't seen every single platform out there. There might be one platform that's doing it really well in terms of natural engagement and activity. Other than people creating, huge WhatsApp groups, etc. But no, I think it's about kind of really thinking about looking at the kind of the student journey and thinking about those different points where, okay, well, this could be an opportunity to embed something. This might be an opportunity to embed something, as opposed to looking at it as a standalone item.
That's great, thank you. Another question: to what extent has in-house industry-based teaching and learning impacted on the reliance of B schools?
Yeah, good question. So we have quite a few data points on this actually in our various reports that we've been, it's something that we kind of look at, and we ask our corporate. So we have a corporate recruiters survey. So we ask some questions throughout there as well, and also in our kind of more general understandings of where people are going and what they're doing. Again, I really think that the need for education and managerial skills is so vast that there is so much space for different types of learning to exist. And I think that these corporate learning, corporate in-house universities, etc., they have been operating for some time now, and yet we still see a huge interest and growth in our area of graduate management education. You can see that in growth of programs, you can see that in development of new programs, and so I think as long as we can demonstrate as a sector that what we're delivering is relevant, I don't think that I think that there's space for both to exist.
Thank you. Do you think that Metaverse will take off in education?
I think the Metaverse will again, this is largely my own personal view, so I will caveat it with that, is that they're often in technology, the last 5 to 10 years, something will be created for a specific purpose, and often there isn't a question of, well, should it have been created, right? Because you're running at the pace of technology, and people can do something, so they do it. That's not the first time in kind of humankind that things have happened like that. And I appreciate I'm probably looking at it as quite an existential lens, but for me, it's not really about the impact of the metaverse in the education space. Although we have already seen, we've got Harvard who are doing a short course in the metaverse. We've got someone setting up in Europe a kind of small business school, very tech focused, with some huge investment behind it, thinking about how they launch a program in the metaverse. So this isn't, it's already happening, but it's not really that for me. It's really the unintended consequences, or no, maybe the intended consequences, but what will the impact be on how on society, on how people consume, information, how they consume connection, how they interact with each other. I think those are the considerations that kind of are more the permutations that I think are will impact the sector. I really think that, and I think those are things that are really hard to envisage and plan for, because there are often things that we don't even know the full extent of yet on some of those things.
Fantastic, thank you. That's all we have time for today. Thank you once again to our partner GMAC and Alicia for such an interesting insight. Thank you all for joining us and for your brilliant questions and interactions. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did, but if you missed anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in post-event comms and on the AMBA and BGA websites within a week. Thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thank you.